All right, let's talk about places where the rules aren't just rules, they're more like ironclad decrees. We're talking about authoritarian regimes, those lovely systems of government where dissent is about as welcome as a skunk at a picnic. These governments, often labelled as oppressive because, let's face it, they are, justify their iron grip on power through various means. Sometimes it's a delightful cocktail of political ideologies, claiming their way is the only way, like a stubborn GPS that refuses to acknowledge road closures. And then there's always the classic national security card, which is basically the governmental equivalent of when your parents said you couldn't go out because you're grounded. But instead of missing out on a party, you're missing out on, basic human rights. North Korea, a land shrouded in more secrecy than a celebrity's internet search history. This is the Hermit Kingdom, ruled by the Kim dynasty with the subtlety of a sledgehammer in a porcelain shop. They've got this delightful little policy called the 3 generations punishment. Foreign media? Banned. They prefer their news served with a hefty side of propaganda, like a culinary school dropout trying to pass off mashed potatoes as cloud puree. It's all designed to keep their citizens in line, or at least too terrified to step out of it. Next up, we're jetting off to Saudi Arabia, a land of vast deserts, oil wealth, and, well, let's just say women wouldn't be caught dead driving a car there a few years ago. Progress, people. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is a monarchy where the House of Saud lays down the law, and that law is often based on a strict interpretation of Sharia law. Now, before you start picturing everyone wandering around in robes and sandals, let's be clear. Saudi Arabia is a modern country in many ways. But that modernity exists alongside some pretty archaic rules. Gender segregation is still very much a thing, and freedom of speech is treated like a particularly fragile houseplant. Look at, but don't you dare touch. Just ask Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist who dared to criticize the Saudi government. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for him. Hold on to your headscarves, folks, because we're heading to Iran, the Islamic Republic where the Ayatollahs have the final say on pretty much everything. We're talking mandatory dress codes, folks. Women are expected to be covered from head to toe, like walking pieces of extremely modest furniture. And God forbid you're a member of the LGBTQ+ community in Iran. Being yourself can land you in deep trouble, and by deep trouble I mean potential imprisonment or worse. The internet is heavily censored because apparently the Iranian government thinks it's their job to curate your social media feed. And don't even get me started on protests. Those are usually met with the kind of force that suggests someone skipped the chapter on peaceful crowd control in the Dictator's Handbook. Remember that feeling when you realize you left your phone in the back of a taxi? That's kind of what happened to the people of Afghanistan when the Taliban strolled back into power. Except instead of a lost phone, they lost, their basic human rights. Education for girls, gone, music, banned, freedom of speech. You're having a laugh, aren't you? The Taliban, with their strict interpretation of Islamic law, have essentially turned the country into a giant time capsule. And not the fun kind with old toys and candy. Women, in particular, have borne the brunt of this regressive shift, facing restrictions that would make a Victorian-era patriarch blush. Public executions are back on the menu, because apparently nothing says justice like a public spectacle of violence. Now let's hop over to China, the land of delicious dumplings, the Great Wall, and a government that seems to have a real thing for surveillance. We're talking facial recognition software, internet monitoring, and the whole 9 yards. They've even got this lovely little thing called the social credit system, which is basically like a Yelp review for your entire life, except instead of getting bad takeout, you get denied loans, travel permits, and possibly even access to your own cat videos. And if you're thinking of heading to the Xinjiang region, well, just be aware that the Chinese government has been accused of some pretty horrific human rights abuses against the Uyghur population there. We're talking mass detention, forced labor, and cultural suppression on a scale that would make even the most jaded dystopian novelists say, okay, that's a bit much. Censorship is the name of the game in China, where the government has a bit of a, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all policy. Well, folks, buckle up because we're heading to Myanmar, a country where the military seems to have missed the memo about civilian rule being a good thing. They've been playing musical chairs with power for decades, and let's just say the music stopped abruptly in 2021 when they decided to grab all the chairs and declare a military junta. Since then, it's been a greatest hits of authoritarianism, arbitrary arrests, targeted violence against ethnic groups, looking at you, Rohingya, and a crackdown on the free press that would make a censor blush. Let's set sail for the Horn of Africa, shall we? Specifically to Eritrea, a nation that's often referred to as Africa's North Korea. This is a country ruled by President Isaias Afwerki, a man who clearly skipped the part in the dictator's handbook about term limits. He's been in charge since 1993, and let's just say he's not a big fan of, letting people leave. Eritrea's got this delightful little thing called indefinite national service, which is basically a fancy way of saying mandatory military service that never ends. And don't even think about complaining about it. Freedom of the press? What freedom of the press? Eritrea's got about as much press freedom as a goldfish has room to roam. It's a one-party state, folks, and that party is firmly in control. Next stop, Turkmenistan. It's a country in Central Asia that's known for its vast reserves of natural gas and its even vaster reserves of government censorship. This is a place where the president, who has a bit of a thing for gold statues and renaming months after himself, has essentially created a personality cult that would make Kim Jong-un blush. And don't even think about criticizing the government, because that's a one-way ticket to a forced disappearance. It's like a magic trick, except instead of a rabbit disappearing from a hat, it's your freedom disappearing from your life. Oh, and if you're a fan of independent thought, well, you might want to pack some blinders, because Turkmenistan is all about that state-sponsored propaganda. It's like living in a world where the only news channel is Fox News, except instead of Tucker Carlson yelling about the liberal agenda, it's just endless praise for the president and his impeccable taste in marble statues. Hold on to your potatoes, folks, because we're headed to Belarus, a country that's often referred to as Europe's last dictatorship. This is a place where President Alexander Lukashenko, a man who's been in power since before some of you were even born, 1994 to be exact, rules with an iron fist and a questionable moustache. He's not exactly a fan of dissent, which is why he's made it his personal mission to crack down on any and all opposition. We're talking rigged elections, imprisoned journalists, and enough silenced voices to make a choir director weep. Oh, and if you're a fan of peaceful protests, well, you might want to reconsider your hobbies. Lukashenko's got a very particular way of dealing with protesters, and let's just say it involves a lot less listening to the people and a lot more tear gas and rubber bullets. Last but not least, let's hop over to Russia, a land of vodka, bears, and a government that seems to have mistaken the word democracy for autocracy in the dictionary. At the helm is Vladimir Putin, a man who's made a career out of consolidating power and silencing dissent. He's been in charge for so long that some people probably think he came with the Kremlin. And if you're thinking of expressing any opinions that might contradict the official Kremlin line, well, you might want to invest in a good lawyer, or a good disguise, or maybe just a one-way ticket to a country with a slightly less, shall we say, proactive approach to dealing with dissent. From propaganda laws that equate homosexuality with pedophilia to actual physical violence against LGBTQ+ individuals, Russia's not exactly leading the charge for LGBTQ+ rights. Well, there you have it, folks, a whirlwind tour of some of the world's most authoritarian regimes. From the forced labor camps of North Korea to the surveillance state of China, it's a stark reminder that freedom is a fragile thing, a precious right that can be eroded, chipped away at, or even outright crushed under the boot of tyranny. The impact on citizens living under these regimes is profound. From stifled dreams and silenced voices to the ever-present fear of stepping out of line, the global community has responded with a mixture of sanctions, condemnation, and, let's be honest, sometimes a healthy dose of helplessness. But hey, at least we're talking about it, right? And that's a start. Educate yourself, speak out against injustice, and for goodness sake, don't take your freedom for granted. And while you're at it, why not give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more hard-hitting explorations of the world's injustices.